If we look at what's going on in the world today, we see so many different things happening at the same time, and it can be very confusing trying to make sense of the debates around these things. But when you actually look at these things holistically, it starts to make some sense. Unfortunately, what we have at the moment is a lot of people in different fields looking at everything in isolation. So you've got one lot of people looking at climate change, one lot of people looking at energy, a bunch of guys looking at food, some other guys looking at the economy, some other guys looking at terrorism and foreign policy. And what I think is really important to do is to look at these things as part of a global system. And when you do that, you actually come away with a different perspective. My view, having looked at a lot of these trends, is that some of the most worrying predictions are most likely to be true. If you look at these things in their totality, what we're seeing is industrial civilization is unsustainable. And all of these different crises are really just different manifestations of the fact that this civilization in its current form cannot survive the 21st century. My name is Nafeez Mossaddeq Ahmed. I'm an international security analyst. I run a think tank in London called the Institute for Policy Research and Development. I specialise in the study of mass violence. I've published extensively on terrorism, imperialism and conflict. And in trying to understand mass violence, I've been looking more deeply at the systemic and structural issues such as climate change, energy depletion, food production, economic crisis, and how these crises interact with one another and how they can also aggravate and radicalize conflicts. I've been trying to understand what is actually going on in each of these crises, trying to get a grip on the debates between experts. So for example, what is climate change and is it real? What is energy depletion? Is it real? How does it work? Well, are these things just something that we're being told? And I've tried to really separate out vested interests from actual data and evidence.
Vision is the most important of the human senses. We learn to see only as we practice using the eyes.
When we're looking at these crises, we're looking at them in isolation. We're unable to see them as parts of a whole. So, to the extent that you have climate scientists looking in a very narrow sense only at our interference with our environment, and looking only, for example, at environmental degradation, they're not able to see the links that that has directly with the structure of our global economy and how that structure in a way compels us to go on this path of infinite growth just to survive, just to stop our businesses from failing. They have to continue growing every year. They have to increase their profits. That's just your baseline for survival. So the doctrine of unlimited growth is a failed doctrine. It cannot work. And it's creating absolute disaster. But most of the experts looking at these things are only looking at it from their own lens. So for them it's an invisible crisis because they don't really see the bigger picture. Most of the institutions which are working on these things are doing so on the basis of conventional policy-making assumptions. These are now totally outmoded and highly questionable. Two of the most influential thinkers that have been responsible for some of these assumptions are Samuel Huntington and Francis Fukuyama. Samuel Huntington was a Harvard professor. He was a political scientist, and he was also a long-time advisor to the US government. He specifically advised President Lyndon Johnson on the Vietnam War. He became quite well known for writing a book called The Clash of Civilizations in the 1990s. Where he projected that the future of international conflict would be between major civilizational blocs. So the Islamic world, the Western world, he separated these out and said that this is where there will be major conflict in the future.
All I'm saying is that in some non-Western cultures, and Islam and Confucian culture are the usual examples, there's great resistance to accepting Western values of human rights and democracy because these countries come from totally different cultural traditions.
The other guy that's also very interesting is Francis Fukuyama, who used to be head of policy planning at the State Department. He wrote a book called The End of History. And he argued that with the collapse of communism, there is no viable alternative to neoliberal politics or economics. You know, the neoliberal system, where you have liberal democracies, the free market system, these have triumphed. We have no other system which can offer a viable alternative.
Sure, if you want to measure greatness by purely selfish materialism, sure.
All right, then how do you want to measure it?
Well, there are other values, you know.
Now, wait a minute, just a minute. What's wrong with this type of materialism? I mean, it's the difference between life in the jungle and life in civilization.
So the ideas of Huntington and Fukuyama became kind of fused into this overall idea that the current system we have is in fact the most advanced system ever possible for humanity. And the violence that we have in this system are conflicts with lesser civilizations, such as the Muslim world. When you believe these things, when you believe the current system is the best we have, and when you believe that the war on terror is just a war against crazy barbarians that hate us because of our freedom and our way of life, then you're out of touch with reality, and you don't really get the systemic causes of what's going on. So when policymakers see things like climate change, peak oil, the economic crisis, or the fact that we're reaching limits in food production, they try to deal with them in isolation, instead of recognizing that these crises are fundamentals of a failing global system. Because of this ideology, because of these subliminal ideas, we're straitjacketed, and we're unable to respond in the way that we need to. Recognizing that we need not just tinkering, but transformation of the system. But the question is, how do we do that? My view is that we need to go back to each of these crises, understand how they work, and how they're so fundamentally interconnected. Over the next decade, I think we'll see increasing evidence that we have passed the tipping point on climate change. For me, it's very clear, having looked at the scientific data and looked at thousands of different scientific papers, that global warming is real. The mainstream assessment from the majority of scientists that it's largely because of fossil fuel emissions, and I'm convinced that that is accurate. And I've looked in detail at a lot of the skeptic arguments that suggest, for example, that maybe climate change is due to natural variations such as the sun, or it's due to cyclical variations in the Earth's natural climate cycles. I did this with an open mind, and I came to the conclusion that while these are certainly factors in understanding climate change, they do not explain the current trend of global warming. For me, really, the debate is how fast it's happening, and is it likely to create serious problems for civilization to survive? Most of the policymakers have agreed to this baseline target that we should reduce the amount of fossil fuels in the atmosphere to about 450 parts per million. That will get us to a 2 degrees Celsius rise by mid-century. And if we can stabilize at that level, then we will avoid some of the worst effects. Unfortunately, that's unlikely to be the case. We have a lot of new scientific data which has come in the last few years